used the word tsunami. This is rather rude of me. I don't think the word is accurate. I think the correct word to describe the phenomenon of mass migration is industry. It's an industry. It's an industry because it is a phenomenon which, as the first speaker has just said, affects the whole of Europe on an absolutely colossal scale. It began a quarter of a century ago, I think, on these levels. The kind of figures we're talking about, they've already been mentioned for Sweden. I'm a British citizen. You probably know that in 2023, the number of arrivals into the United Kingdom was 1.3 million in 1 year. This has been going on in Britain. I live in France, but I will say a few words about Britain, at levels of net migration of hundreds of thousands, not 100,000, but hundreds of thousands, 500,000, 600,000. It's been going at that levels for a quarter of a century. And that's why I say that we have to understand the problem of migration as an industry. It requires industrial levels of logistics and planning and organization, not necessarily centralized, to transport what comes to millions of people from Syria to Oslo, from Afghanistan to London, or whatever. Obviously, there are many factors, you all know this, organized crime, but also immigration lobbies, and the famous NGOs, the state, United Nations agencies, and so on. And in my opinion, I'd like to share with you some reflections. I think the only way to stop this, and indeed to encourage the reverse tendency, is to attack this industry at its very basis, and to reverse the very things which are causing it. And in that context, I'd like to talk about three issues: economic causes, legal causes and legal things which facilitate mass migration on this industrial scale, and then say a few words briefly about demography. It seems to me that there are at least three economic causes of mass migration, of industrial scale mass migration, which we need to abolish and reverse in order to encourage the opposite movement. The first is surely social benefits, of which housing is probably the most important. I don't know how it works in Oslo or in other Norwegian cities, but in London and Paris, I live in Paris, every new build has to, when a new block of flats is built, I think this is probably the case all over Europe, has to give typically 40 or 50% of its new apartments to social housing. This is an absolutely classic example of a government measure designed to solve a problem, the problem being that property is too expensive, but which ends up in fact aggravating the problem. It aggravates it, why? Because it takes property out of the market, therefore there's a less supply, and instead, of course, gives it to the state. So it's a classic example of a death spiral. Now, of course, a lot of the social housing goes to immigrants, and that surely has to stop. That is an absolutely basic, fundamental thing. If people's free or cheap leases were to be terminated, they would presumably go home. And that housing could either, of course, be given to nationals, or it could be sold. This was famously done in Britain in the 1980s. Social housing was sold off. And this, of course, increased the supply of property on the market. And if it were to happen again, we hope that it would cause property prices to fall, and therefore enable young people easier access to the property market. There's nothing wrong or racist with saying that social housing should go only to nationals. In the European Union, it's already illegal to practice what they call benefit tourism. So if you're a Romanian, you can't go to the Netherlands and claim social benefit. That's already part of European Union law. So by the same logic, there's no reason why that shouldn't be true also of social housing. Exclusively for nationals, possibly for certain professions, nurses, police, and all the rest of it, but surely only for nationals. The second aspect, it seems to me, the second economic aspect of mass migration, of industrial mass migration, are the lobbies, the structures, the governmental and non-governmental structures which facilitate and encourage migration. And these are colossal. The International Organization for Migration, the United Nations Agency, has an annual budget of $3 billion. You're soon talking serious money. It has 22,000 staff. This is an industry. In the European Union, Norway luckily isn't a member of the European Union, but in the European Union, in the current multi-annual financial framework, which is in the process of being drawn up, the European Union is planning to spend 12 billion euros over 7 years, admittedly. The 3 billion for the International Organization on Migration is every year. There's 12 billion over 7 years. 12 billion on asylum, migration and integration. It's going to spend 2.28 billion euros on the European Union Agency for Asylum, which has more than 1,500 staff. It's going to spend 25 billion euros, 25,000 million euros, on what it calls thematic facilities. I've no idea what that is, but it's basically money for encouraging migration. All of it managed by the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. In France, where I live, every year, France spends 500 million euros on asylum centres. The total cost of migration in France is estimated by the Observatoire de l'immigration et de la démographie at 2 billion euros a year. 2 billion euros a year just in France. Take another example. There are so many of these, you're probably familiar with some of them. The European Council on Refugees and Exiles. It's an alliance of no fewer than 125 migrant lobbies in more than 40 countries. And what these lobbies do is they, of course, lobby for migration, and they are typically very active in legal work. I'll come back to this in a minute, the issue of legal migration. But their role, the role of these lobbies in setting up a legal structure is absolutely colossal. And of course, all these figures I've given you, these tens of billions that I've given you, those figures are direct spending. We haven't even calculated, if you take those figures, the indirect costs of migration on things like health and education, the health system or the education system. In France, if I take France again as an example, the number of non-French speaking school children has increased by 153% in the last decade and a half. So that is obviously a very severe indirect cost. And as I'm sure you know, a number of the NGOs, these lobbies, these hundreds of lobbies that I've mentioned, a number of them are non-governmental organizations, but guess what? They're funded by governments, like most NGOs. In fact, they're just proxies for the governments. I represent the Dutch political party Forum for Democracy, and in the Netherlands, one of the biggest NGOs, supposedly NGOs, is Vluchtelingenwerk Nederland, so Refugee Work Netherlands, and it's funded by the Dutch National Lottery. So it seems to me obvious that people have to stop making a living out of migration. You've got many tens of thousands of people who are being paid to encourage and facilitate migration. And that industry, literally industry, obviously has to be closed down. Third point, and this to me is in fact the key. It seems to me that migration surely is driven by dysfunctionality in the labour market. We all live in Europe in countries which tax labour at an astronomical rate. If you have a cleaning lady in France and you pay her 100 euros, you in fact have to pay 185 euros. This is true of the Netherlands. I expect it's true of most Scandinavian countries as well. In other words, labour is taxed at nearly 100%. Now this means that labour is therefore more expensive. If you tax something, it gets more expensive. And as you all know in this room, migration is a way of countering this dysfunctionality in the labour market, which state policy has itself produced. State policy creates the problem and then tries to resolve the problem by importing millions of workers from elsewhere. Now, even if these workers don't work necessarily on the black, even if they work legally and therefore are paid the minimum wage, the fact that you have so many people coming into the country obviously takes some pressure, let us say, off the labour market, and that's why the immigration lobby supports it. But this is a doom loop, it's a death spiral, because you are, of course, simply kicking the can down the road. You are creating all these other costs in order to solve the problem which is created, as I say, in the first place, by excessive taxes on labour. And everybody says if you increase in migration, you increase gross domestic product. But that is true only in absolute terms, because there are more people. It's not true in per capita terms. And if we look at the countries of Europe, which have had, Europe is a terribly low growth area generally for all kinds of reasons, also including high taxation. But if we look at countries like Poland and Slovenia and Slovakia, where there are much lower levels of immigration than in Western Europe, well, guess what? They have higher growth rates than we do. And some of these countries are now taking over the traditional countries of Western Europe. Slovenia, for example, now has a higher per capita GDP than Spain. So immigration represents a drag. It's not an economic benefit, it's a drag. There's another issue, and that is monetary policy. All our states are drowning in debt. The United Kingdom borrows £150 billion a year. It spends £110 billion a year servicing its debt. It's basically nearly bankrupt. And ever since the financial crisis of 2008, European countries, both the Eurozone and non-Euro countries, have responded, as you know, to these crises with monetary creation, creating, in the case of the Eurozone, something like 60 billion euros a month for many, many years. When you print so much money, you have inflation. It's absolutely obvious. And you may know that the British Prime Minister, now ex-British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, after the COVID pandemic, has said on television, he said in an interview, that the Treasury came to him, the Ministry of Finance came to him, and said, well, you've printed all this money, you've printed, I think it was 300 billion pounds in a matter of months. You've printed all this money, you're going to get inflation. The only solution is to import masses of migrants in order to drive down labour costs. So again, it's a bit like with the housing. We see how the state, or taxing labour, the state creates a problem and then creates another problem in order to try to solve the problem which it has itself created. The famous Boris wave of migration, just to give you some ideas, I mentioned 1.3 million migrants into the United Kingdom in 2023. The figures for, that was under Rishi Sunak, the figures for Boris Johnson were, I think in 2022, 906,000 net, sorry, in 2023, 906,000 net migration. So of the 1.3 million, 906,000 stayed, and there were a few hundred thousand who left, which represents an increase of 300% since Brexit. So much for taking back control. That's what I think we need to do on the economic level. All these policies, the ones I've mentioned, high tax on labour, social housing, monetary policy, they are dysfunctional policies of which migration is one of many consequences. And if we're to make our societies healthy again, we need to change all those policies and indeed completely abandon them. Second part of reversing this trend is legal, because of course this is all governed by law. The economics is the gravitational pull, but it's all facilitated by law. And under the legal category, there are, again, three things I think we need to do. it seems obvious that the entire asylum system must be abolished. It is completely corrupt. It is a racket. The BBC did a report in April revealing how lawyers, British lawyers, they charge handsome fees for this, but they can produce any number of fake documents that a migrant wants. Let's say someone who's come to the country with a student visa and wants to stay. They produce fake documents, they charge several, say £6,000-7,000, and the person gets to stay. Very often, by the way, by pretending that they're gay. It's one of the many abuses of the asylum system. You can say almost anything and you'll be let in. In the Netherlands, they introduced a bureaucratic incentive, to speed up asylum applications. And the incentive was that if the asylum application was too slow, the asylum seeker got money. Well, guess what? This ended up giving €34,000 to each asylum seeker whose application was being dealt with too slowly. They spent €36 million on this in 2024. The Netherlands is a country where asylum seekers arrive at a rate of 1,000 a week. Another abuse in France, but I'm sure it's everywhere, is unaccompanied minors. The number of unaccompanied minor, so people underage who have arrived without their parents, has risen by 370% in 10 years. It's obviously a racket. It's fraud. So that is the legal framework, if you like, which encourages this gravitational pull. Another dimension of the legal framework is the European Court of Human Rights. You may not know this, but in November of last year, or rather in 2024, the European Court of Human Rights found against Denmark because it was trying to deport an Iraqi drug trafficker. And in cases where the European Court of Human Rights has allowed countries to deport criminals, there are two cases, at least recent ones, where it has created a right of return. It has said in its rulings that if these people are deported, okay, they can be deported, but they have to be allowed to come back. Article 8, right to family life. The European Court of Human Rights, you may know, vetoed Britain's Rwanda plan. The Conservative government planned to send asylum seekers physically to Rwanda and have their asylum applications processed there. That was vetoed by Strasbourg. So it's obvious that in addition to getting rid of the asylum, all the legal conventions and so on asylum, all the structures, it's obvious that countries will have to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, as several political parties in Britain are proposing to do. Second legal element, Schengen. The Schengen Agreement acts as a gravitational pull on migration. If you can land in Lampedusa and go to Stockholm without showing your passport, that obviously creates a massive gravitational force bringing people into Europe. And I know this personally from having visited a Red Cross refugee, asylum or whatever you call it, camp outside Calais in the late 1990s. This camp was set up by the Red Cross because suddenly, within a couple of years after Schengen entering into force in 1995, guess what? People arrived, the ones who wanted to cross the channel all ended up in Calais. There's a direct cause and effect between the Schengen Agreement, which, as you know, abolishes internal frontiers inside the Schengen zone, and immigration. Third legal point, orders to leave the territory. If your visa has expired, you have to leave the territory. In France, there are probably between 700,000 and 1 million people who have received such orders to leave the territory and who stay. It's very obvious that the state needs to establish its authority and make sure that those orders to leave are in fact respected and obeyed. You probably know that yesterday the European Pact on Migration and Asylum entered into force. This Pact on Migration and Asylum, which is yet another legal structure, I'm quoting now, it wants to promote legal pathways for immigration. It wants to develop legal migration. Well, this is another trick. People say, oh, we're against illegal migration, but legal migration, that's a different matter. It's a trick. It's legal to cross a boat in a dinghy, to cross the English Channel in a boat and ask for asylum. That's not illegal. So to divide off so-called legal immigration from illegal is ultimately meaningless. Only national policies can tackle migration, not European policies. And I've watched with great sadness and some anger European political parties, including on the conservative right, the Europa's sovereign nations group, voting in favour of European policies to deport people, hubs or whatever they call them. That is a mistake. You cannot give power to Brussels, because if Brussels says, I'm going to take care of removing people from your territory, then tomorrow Brussels can decide to do the opposite. The third thing I'd like to talk about is not, if you like, directly connected, but it is actually demography. We all know that Europe is going through a demographic winter. It seems to me that in addition to changing the severe structural dysfunctions of our economies, high tax on labour, monetary inflation, excessive social benefits, one of the things we surely all have to do all across Europe is promote natalism, is to promote people having children. I've been in Oslo for 24 hours. I've seen more LGBT flags than Norwegian flags. That is also a problem. Again, if I take France as an example, after the First World War, France lost, as everyone knows, I think something like 2 million men. And throughout the entire 20th century after the First World War, France has practiced natalist policies. Your tax goes down if you have more children. There are crèches everywhere. Education is free. You get tax off if you employ a nanny and so on. These things surely should be generalized. They've, of course, been phased out recently in France as well. So all these things need to be corrected and reformed in order to, I would say, make our societies healthy again. I think indeed that mass migration is a symptom of societies which in a way are sick. Societies which have mortgaged and are mortgaging their present for their future, just of course building up the problems further down the line. Everybody understands that an economy is sick or dysfunctional if its imports exceed its exports. Well, the same goes for population as it goes for goods and services. We need, therefore, substantial economic and legal reform. We also need a very profound cultural and philosophical change. It's simply not true, it is a globalist lie, to say that an African can be exchanged for a European. That is not true. There are differences in character according to different ethnicities. Ethnicities and cultures are not interchangeable. And the idea that they are interchangeable is, of course, the intellectual cause of this whole problem. It's a horrific combination of woke ideology and naked capitalism, or rather it's not capitalism, because precisely it is a system, a racket, by which profits are privatized and costs are socialized. So I think that just as ethnic bonds are a reality for migrant groups, as everyone with eyes to see can tell, these people stick together, these same bonds should be strengthened also for Europeans. If we remove the root cause of mass migration, the root causes of mass migration, this sick combination of borderless globalism with massive state spending financed by debt, if we do that, then I believe the current levels of migration will disappear and possibly even go into reverse, as I hope. Thank you.